Chapter 1 Filipina Girls. Filipina girls? Well, Thai girls are hip. I really dig those sexy styles they wear. And the Hong Kong girls with the way they talk. They knock me out when I'm over there. The Singapore girls really make you feel alright. And the Bali girls with the way they kiss. They keep their boyfriends hot at night. But I wish they all could be like Filipina girls. The Philippines has the sunshine and the hurricanes. And the girls all get so tanned, such a sandy beach color. I dig a French bikini on a Filipina girl. Dolls by a palm tree in the sand. I've been all around this great big world. And I seen all kinds of girls. Yeah, but I can't wait to get back to the Philippines. Back to the cutest girls in the world. I wish they all could be like Filipina girls. This song can be imagined being played by the Beach Boys, California Girls, or the Beatles, back in the USSR. Flight to Manila from Bangkok Tuesday, July 29, 2014. Professor John MacLeod settled into his seat on the long flight to Manila with the seriousness of a Nobel Prize candidate preparing a breakthrough paper. Unfortunately for the academic community, his mind was not occupied with molecular biology, anthropology, or even the economics of Southeast Asia. Instead, somewhere over the Indian Ocean, he became convinced he could compose a song to rival the California Girls classic by the Beach Boys, as shown above. As the cabin lights dimmed and the flight attendants distributed suspiciously rubbery chicken dinners, Professor John stared dreamily out the window and reflected upon the great cultural mystery of his age. Why did every expatriate in Asia seem to believe that their favorite country contained the most beautiful women on earth? Searching for the holy grail of the perfect woman. Professor John MacLeod's research of Thai working girls on Sukhumvit Road, Bangkok, came to an end for the time being. But the research committee at the Polar University in Norway, where he was a professor of philosophy and English language and literature, had proposed that he should travel to the Philippines in search of the holy grail of feminine perfection, and conduct further research and exploration there. Rational objections. John's mother had prosaically announced over a cup of tea one day, saying that, "Your father said that all women are the same." Of course, this referred to the fact that my father had worked in many countries in Africa and Asia, although he deceitfully claimed to have had no experience with womb, although noting that Burmese womb smelt of garlic and fish, as a kind of alibi of why he was not interested in them. Sexual desire and illusions. Dogs and other animals do not need to self-reflect on reasons for copulation, as this is governed by instincts and chemicals. However, human male sexuality is often based on various ideas, such as the attractiveness of illegal sexual objects, Epstein, the allure of prostitutes, Stormy Daniels, and so on and so on. In other words, John's the goal was to provide a comparative example to his research in Thailand. The point of this endeavor was that John's connection to girls and women in Thailand was mainly based on so-called relationships to working girls, while in the Philippines the relationships were very different in that they were more personal. The major component, money, may have been the same, but the Filipina girls and women claimed to have emotional ties to John. Of course, it is naive to believe that men have no monetary obligations in marital relations with the opposite sex, as compared to prostitution, but this is a topic we will not delve into further here. Thus, the Filipino girls were perhaps smarter than the Thai girls, as John felt no long-time obligation to a Thai woman of pleasure, but he felt some kind of social obligation to his Filipina girlfriends. Similarly, Donald Trump felt little obligation to Stormy Daniels and the other whores he had procured throughout his life, but his obligations to Melanie, his current wife of 2026, was of course different. She was an expectant widow, being 20 or 30 years younger than him, and would soon one day inherit his empire, but no doubt only after a battle with all the previous wives, girlfriend, children and so on, which would no doubt keep the tabloids in business for several years long after Donald's death. But as the Bible says, you reap what you sow. But to get back to the point, the Filipina girls and women exploited the Christian idea that husbands were ethically and financially responsible for their wife and family. The Thai women were Buddhists, so they did not exploit this idea to the same extent. This was very ironic, as John became responsible for some time for many of families in the Philippines that weren't his families. But then John was also often a dupe, to put it mildly. Of course, as mentioned, it is naive to believe that relationships between the sexes in a class and gender-skewed society are totally free and don't involve money. No matter how you look at it, money is often a part of the relationship between the sexes. Hotels. When in Ermita, Manila, Professor John often stayed at either the New World Hotel or the Pan Pacific Hotel. Norway, it should be remembered, was once among the poorer nations of Northern Europe in the mid-20th century. Then came the discovery of oil beneath the North Sea, and suddenly a country whose ancestors had once sailed across the oceans looking for wealth found wealth bubbling up beneath its own waters. As a consequence, the price of a 5-star hotel in the East was often little more than the price of a modest 2- or 3-star establishment back home. Thus John, who was merely an academic of average means, could temporarily masquerade as a minor prince whenever he traveled abroad to the East. Such are the strange miracles of economics. One day you are correcting student essays on Shakespeare, the next you are drinking imported whiskey in a marble lobby while uniformed staff address you as a sir with alarming sincerity. Interlude. It should be mentioned that Professor John MacLeod's research report is largely presented in the third person, while the final manuscript is the work of his colleague and editor, the narrator George MacBlair. Both John MacLeod and George MacBlair are professors at the Polar University, and have a relationship not unlike that of Holmes and Dr. Watson in the Tales by Conan Doyle. In other words, George is the rational part of the duo. George MacBlair reports. Neither John nor I are especially qualified as fictional writers, which is perhaps a blessing. Since we are ignorant of many of the accepted laws of narrative, we feel no obligation to obey them. Consequently, what began as a rather tedious account of John's research experiences among the working girls of Manila's entertainment districts has gradually mutated into something else entirely, part travelogue, part social commentary, part memoir, part satire, and occasionally an accidental story of interest. Social commentary. This account has ambitions both as research and so-called documentary fiction. Early English literature, folk tales, chapbooks, and picaresque novels frequently interrupted their narratives with moral observations, sermons, warnings, and philosophical digressions. In this respect, I merely continue an ancient tradition, but my aim is not to didactically lecture the reader, but encourage the reader to think in the manner of Bertolt Brecht. In other words, to drag fiction out of the sump of mere entertainment in the manner of the tabloid press, providing the latest tidbits about the sexual and criminal financial wanderings of the royalty and the rich. In other words, the tabloid readership love to see the rich and royalty be dragged into the dirt, as this perhaps give them some illusory sense of justice, when their own lives exist in the sewers of human excrement. Tabloids and excrement. The tabloids make most of their money from dealing in cheap excrement. In 2022, in a Sun newspaper column, the neo-fascist Jeremy Clarkson wrote that he dreamed of Meghan Markle being made to parade naked through the streets while crowds chanted "shame" and threw lumps of excrement at her. But enough of these meanderings, we need to continue to the actual field of research, which in our case is Ermita, Manila, and more specifically, the Gold Coast Bar. Chapter 2: The Gold Coast Bar. Mabini Street, Ermita, Manila. In other words, to return to the specifics of Professor MacLeod's research, he investigated the Ermita district, in order to provide some raw material for his research report. The Gold Coast Bar. Not far from his hotel in Ermita, he chanced on the Gold Coast Bar that had perhaps been owned at one point by an Australian, thus the name, as this term stems from the coast of Australia. There is a certain irony here. Brown Sugar and Gold Coast Slaves. In the opening line of Brown Sugar by the Rolling Stones, the song mentions the Gold Coast slave ship bound for cotton fields. But this is of course another Gold Coast, the historical region on the Gulf of Guinea in West Africa that is now largely Ghana. During the transatlantic slave trade, the Gold Coast was one of the major areas from which enslaved Africans were taken and shipped to the Americas. In the song, the phrase Gold Coast slave ship evokes ships carrying enslaved women and men from West Africa to the American South, where they were sold in slave markets, such as New Orleans, and forced to work on plantations. The text of the song makes this explicit by mentioning slave markets and a slave trader. Of course, the Rolling Stones, in the spirit of the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 1970s in the UK, present this as a fact that benefits all concerned. In other words, in the slave markets of New Orleans, women were not just bought for their ability to work for free as slaves, but also as sexual slaves of their white owners. In other words, the white plantation owners often engaged in sexual relations with their slaves, producing a new race of light-skinned brown slaves, which is often referred to in blues songs. These women were often considered more attractive than their deep black sisters, such as Halle Berry, who played in a James Bond film. However, the U.S. white race in principle, like the German Nazis, were opposed to a mixing of the races in line of racial purity, ideas that were prevalent during the 19th and 20th centuries, and also to some extent in the 21st century, as witnessed by the rise of right-wing parties, and immigration control. In other words, the systems of apartheid promoted in the American South in the 20th century, and in African countries, such as South Africa and Rhodesia in the 20th century, and Israel in the 21st century. But I am perhaps digressing too far from through the main narrative here. When Professor MacLeod visited the Gold Coast Bar, he was presented with a slave market. That is, the manager said he could choose any sexual slave from a line of about 10 girls and women, who lined up in front of the bar. John later learned that this was normal practice in many bars in the Philippines, and also in Thailand. Choosing Jessica. Of course, he chose Jessica, also called Angelica elsewhere, a small girl about 4 foot 9 inches tall in her socks, and weighing about 40 kilos, who looked like she was 13 years old, but who was perhaps 18 or 19 years old. Although her large fruity melons perhaps betrayed the fact that she was not 13 years old. The girls at the Gold Coast Bar. In other words, the Gold Coast refers to Australia's Gold Coast, but you intentionally refers to the former British colony on the West African coast, modern Ghana, reference in connection with the Atlantic slave trade. Lucky at the Gold Coast Bar. As mentioned, when younger, one of John's favorite songs in the 1960s and 1970s was the song Brown Sugar by the Rolling Stones. Lucky at the Gold Coast Bar. John was often lucky when he went to the Gold Coast Bar. For one reason or another, they didn't seem to have many clients, so every time John showed up he was immediately the star of the show, as can be seen from the picture above. Angelica and Nita. John was sitting together with Angelica and her old school friend, Nita. Christina is also sitting at the table by the door. She used to work behind the bar. See the photo above with several of the bar girls. Dal is sitting there too. Murdoch, John's twin brother, and a dissolute swine. On a previous visit to the bar, John's alter ego, that is, his twin brother Murdoch, had got too drunk and gone pearl diving at the bar counter with both Dal and Tapia, while they were perched on bar stools. This was much to Angelica's annoyance, because she had believed that it was John and not Murdoch doing the pearl diving, also called muff diving. Tapia. John had been interested in Tapia before as a research subject, but she was pregnant now. It was just as well that John didn't get mixed up with Tapia, because she is a drug addict hooked on ice. But this is all another story, and will be told elsewhere. Angelica makes a request. My dear, when WEL you gonna bring me to shopping? Angelica said nonchalantly, twisting her tongue with her own Filipina English, as she wrapped herself around John's left arm. Soon. When I have time, I will get you something nice, like a gold necklace, or so Victoria's Secret lingerie. It's up to you, you're my boss, John said, making Angelica jump with joy. Professor McLeod had been granted an extra budget of $10,000 to pay for so-called additional costs of the research participants. My dear, maybe you can buy me new dress? Oh well, my clothes is old now, Angelica continued babbling. Yes, yes. Are you coming with me in my hotel room tonight? John asked, as he dodged the topic. That kind of talk didn't greatly interest him, but of course, he could buy her what she wanted, if it was within the limits of his research budget, and if she proved to be a good research participant that could provide him with the intimate details of bar girl life and Mabini, and show him practical examples of how bar girls operate. Is the IRIWEL go with you, so you can carry on your professor work? I will show you how bar girls can benefit clients, and I also want to enjoy the night with you, Angelica said, trying her best to communicate romantically with John using her signature Filipino English. But, John remarked, this is not for pleasure, but so I can complete my research project. I hope you understand. Of course, sir, I will do everything you like for your project, she answered obediently, while holding his hand tightly, and giving him a sweet, dog-tooth smile, as she had a cute dog tooth that showed itself like an eager puppy whenever she smiled. Aisha aka Jessica aka Angelica. Of course, John's favorite in the Gold Coast bar was Jessica. As mentioned elsewhere, John had 4 brothers. These had varying degrees of handsomeness, but John was undoubtedly the most handsome, with a tall and slim frame, large brown and expressive mischievous eyes, and a cute nose and long black and flowing black hair that decorated his sallow and pale complexion. But he also had a wandering eye, much like a bee or butterfly wandering from flower to flower. But amongst his brothers he was by far the smartest, but seldom applied his intelligence to anything in particular, as he was by nature lazy, and considered academic brilliance as some kind of deviant behavior. To sum up, John never had to pursue women, as they pursued him, at least well into his 50s. It wasn't the case that John became undesirable to the opposite sex in his 50s and later, but that he no longer attracted the attentions of most 20-year-olds. In this context, John remembered the 50-year birthday party of the father of an old Norwegian girlfriend, who got a little drunk during his party, and exclaimed, "You know, it's funny, when I was 20, I like 50-year-olds, and now I'm 50, I like 20-year-olds. It's not that John was not attracted to older women, but this was a battleground he had not explored yet, and didn't to on his visits to Thailand and the Philippines. Girls in the East. In other words, it seemed young women had started to like him again, or was it just that women and girls in the East were attracted to money, because they were often in such dire straits? At least, the women John had met in the Philippines were not just bar girls and street women, but women in dire straits. John leaves the Gold Coast bar. Oi! You leave already? Dal approached John and Angelica as soon as she saw they were leaving. Yes, darling. We still have some business to attend to, John answered while paying for his drinks. Oh! You not inviting us? Darling, with your business? Only Angelica? Dal complained, and the expressions on the faces of the other girls seemed to agree with her. Maybe Hi Only likes my beauty, haha, Angelica proudly stated, that made the faces of the other girls turn sour. You shut up. Hi online said business, haha, Ristina said mockingly. What business you will do, my dir? Ristina continued harassing John and Angelica, even though the two were already on their way out. Oh. We will perform some prayers. There will be a long night ritual of kneeling, bowing and worshipping at the altar of Venus, John joked. But the joke was beyond Ristina's comprehension, so she took it seriously. Wow. You are religious, John. I only do praying, Ristina commented. John just laughed at the comments of the girls. Dir, come back here soon. YWEL wait for you, the girls from the bar said while waving goodbye to him. In retrospect, John was perhaps still a beginner in the bar life of Manila. The girls perhaps expected that John would take along another girl or two, and not just Jessica. John the celebrity. John feels like he is a celebrity the way they treated him. The way these girls give their attentions to him is over the top. Even on the sidewalks, even with Angelica walking by his side, girls and ladyboys approach him in an endless stream. He feels like a lord that is visiting his lowly serfs. Sir, you want a massage? Sir, aim good and bed. Free trial, sir. Are you alone tonight, my love? Aim very much available. And so on. There were many more bold and wild approaches to John from the many women and ladyboys along the street as he walked with Angelica. John is extremely amused about all their offerings. Inviting him even knowing that he's with a girl already, that is, Angelica. He hadn't really known any women since his wife left him several years ago. He was now making up for lost time. He is like those late bloomer men that only enjoy life to the fullest when they reach the Indian summer of their lives. So these young girls were looking for sugar daddies, or in John's case, a sugar granddaddy. It's like a perfect world made just for him. A give and take connection that both benefit from. He can satisfy them financially and sexually, and they can provide him with endless sexual satisfaction, company and delight. As mentioned, he hadn't really known any women since his wife left him several years ago. He was now making up for lost time. These young girls were looking for sugar daddies. Sugar-coated love. You ought to see my baby. Girl, that man is so fine. He loves me in the morning and every night. He's always on my mind, he got. Sugar-coated love, yeah, sugar-coated love. He's a real-born baby, I don't mean maybe, he's mine. I don't have to worry about money. I don't have to worry about clothes. I don't have to worry about anything, he's my baby. And goodness knows he got. Sugar-coated love, yeah, sugar-coated love. He's a real-born baby, I don't mean maybe, he's mine. But perhaps his improved health and demeanor, not to mention a certain sexual athleticism, had not so much been rediscovered but reinvented. It's like all of his fantasies and lusts have all been saved for future purposes, for today's sexcapades. Back at the New World Hotel in Makati, Jessica. Professor John found himself wondering how a serious academic research project had drifted so far from the approved methodology. Only a few hours earlier he had been seated in the Gold Coast Bar on Mabini Street, Ermita, surrounded by a cheerful parliament of young ladies, each apparently determined to assist him with his ambitious study, the plight of women in the sex industry in the East. After several drinks and a barrage of competing life stories, he had almost forgotten he was supposed to be conducting research rather than becoming one of the variables. As mentioned elsewhere, John's qualitative approach required him to become, in his own words, part of the problem. He had always distrusted the detached academic, like a fly on the wall, or one who observed humanity from a safe distance like a zoologist studying monkeys through binoculars. John preferred immersion. Unfortunately, immersion occasionally became submersion. This was especially true in the case of Angelica. The taxi journey from Ermita to Makati had taken 30 minutes, though Manila traffic possessed a peculiar elasticity whereby 30 minutes could become 90 without warning. Angelica spent most of the journey alternating between affectionate chatter and issuing instructions to the driver in rapid-fire Tagalog. Research Item 1: The White Knickers. During the taxi journey, she had removed her sexy white knickers and wrapped them around John's face, bursting out in a fit of uncontrollable laughter. John smiled a little too. This was a sign of things to come. John deeply inhaled the exotic aroma from her panties, before stuffing them into the inside pocket of his jacket for future research referral. Back in the hotel room, John had already conducted considerable research on the king-size double bed. "Oh my goodness, dear. You are like a calibo, super energetic," Angelica commented exhausted, as they were engaged almost non-stop in participatory research of an intimate nature, John spending much time investigating the hills, valleys and deep clefts and caves of the wonderful land of Angelica. A calibo, John had learned, was a water buffalo. It was not entirely the comparison most men dreamed of receiving from a beautiful young woman, but it was clearly intended as a compliment, regarding its sexual energy, and the dimensions of its equipment. John accepted the compliment graciously. Life in the East had altered him. Between swimming pools, hotel gyms, long walks, and what he privately referred to as fieldwork in bed, he felt fitter than he had in years. His younger research companions often seemed surprised that an older professor possessed both a library card and a pulse. 48 hours naked in bed. One of John's research participants, Diane, had commented with a smile, 48 hours naked in bed, regarding John's research methodology. In fact, John was so fit that most of his research girls and women never seemed to want to leave the bed where most of John's research was conducted. In other words, they never wanted to get out of bed once in it, and were often happy to lie naked for 48 hours at a time. Whether this was due to room service meals, laziness on the part of the girls, John's extensive use of various technical instruments to enhance female pleasure, John's generous gifts provided by his research fund, or due to John's compliments, agile fingers and tongue, and his main research instrument, his middle leg, we will never know. As mentioned, many of his interviews stretched far beyond conventional academic boundaries. Some participants became friends. Others became traveling companions. A few became romantic entanglements. Ethics committees would undoubtedly have suffered collective heart failure. John, however, maintained that human beings were easier to understand once they ceased behaving like footnotes. When involved in what he called participatory research, he believed kindness, consideration and warmth mattered. When involved in participatory research, John thought it only right that he should be as warm as possible. After all, he was not a doctor making a gynecologist's examination, so he would often shower his participants with compliments. For example, chatting in bed with Angelica, he might say things like, "Your two sets of lips are extremely alike, both sweet and wet, that is your nether and upper lips." In other words, Professor did not find it difficult to adore his beautiful young research assistants, such as Angelica. Of course, John did not only shower these young research participants with verbal compliments, but also with monetary gifts from his research fund. John would often have a bottle of red wine, more specifically, Baron Montalto, on his bedside table, so that after a couple of glasses he would often wax lyrical like a Renaissance baron of the John Donne species. In other words, he was generous with compliments and frequently guilty of outrageous flattery. After a long and explorative research session on the king-size double bed, John poured himself another generous glass of Sicilian Baron Montalto red wine. He let the taste of the wine linger in his mouth, and then declared, holding the glass of wine aloft, as if he was a Renaissance court poet, "You are beautiful from your head to your toes, my dear. In fact, let me kiss your sweet little feet." Angelica laughed. Professor, you are like a bolero, always saying sweet words. That is because I am a poet and wordsmith. Some men, like blacksmiths, shape metal into swords. I shape and refine words into poetry, especially when I can compliment a beautiful young princess like yourself. Angelica didn't have a clue what he was talking about, but replied, let's just say you are a very naughty man. This observation was probably closer to the truth. In other words, after a glass or two of red wine he became susceptible to literary digressions. Having spent years teaching Renaissance poetry in universities across America, Australia, and Norway, he frequently found himself quoting dead poets at entirely inappropriate moments. John Donne's To His Mistress Going to Bed. He began reciting lines from John Donne's To His Mistress Going to Bed. Angelica listened politely. She understood approximately 3 words. Nevertheless, she nodded encouragingly as professors, like parrots, become distressed if deprived of an audience. Lying beside her, John amused himself by rewriting Donne's famous colonial metaphor. Oh my Filipino girl, my newfound land. My kingdom safest when with one man manned. The comparison immediately struck him as ridiculous. Christopher Columbus had mistaken one continent for another, resulting in Native Americans being called Indians, a race John in his boyhood had been taught by John Wayne and other American heroes to despise, as they viciously opposed settlers trying to steal their land and destroy their culture, while despoiling white women whenever the opportunity arose. Magellan, another discoverer, had reached the Philippines only to meet an untimely end in Cebu. History suggested that men who compared women to unexplored territories generally understood neither geography nor women. Indeed, the older John became, the more suspicious he grew of all this talk of discovery. Women were not continents. Nor were they mines, colonies, or empires. Donne's famous phrase, my mine of precious stones, my empery, revealed more about 17th-century colonial attitudes than romance. How many wars, John reflected, had been fought over precious stones, gold, oil, spices, and territory? How many politicians still spoke the language of conquest while pretending to speak the language of civilization? Such thoughts occasionally intruded even into the most pleasurable corners of life. Fortunately, Angelica had little interest in colonial history. Professor, she interrupted, why you always thinking? Occupational hazard. Then stop thinking. This proved to be excellent advice. John abandoned Renaissance rhetoric and returned to simpler compliments. You're gorgeous. More gorgeous than Miss Universe? Infinitely. Angelica laughed so hard she nearly spilled the wine. Like many Filipinas, she possessed a gift for finding humor in almost everything. It was one of the reasons John enjoyed the Philippines so much. The country could be chaotic, corrupt, noisy, overcrowded, and occasionally absurd. Yet it also possessed warmth, resilience, and a capacity for laughter that often survived circumstances that would have crushed people elsewhere. As Cole Porter once wrote, you're the top. John frequently borrowed such corny lines. Women rarely believed them. Yet they still seemed to enjoy hearing them. Perhaps compliments worked rather like old popular songs. Everyone knew they were sentimental and corny. Everyone knew they were slightly ridiculous. Yet people continued singing them because life was more pleasant with a soundtrack. And so, somewhere high above Makati, with the city lights glittering below and the traffic still growling in the streets, Professor John continued his peculiar research project, half sociology, half travelogue, half romantic comedy. The arithmetic, he freely admitted, did not quite add up. Neither, for that matter, did most of his adventures. John said goodbye to Angelica. They woke late, switched on CNN, and ordered breakfast from room service. Five-star hotels such as the New World offered breakfast menus of astonishing variety: Filipino breakfasts, American breakfasts, Japanese breakfasts, and enough a la carte items to satisfy a minor royal court. American or English breakfast? Of course, the term American breakfast is something of a misnomer. It belongs in the same category as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which, despite its title, often appears to spend surprisingly little time in the North Atlantic and a remarkable amount of time poking its nose into other people's vegetable patches. Like a hyperactive bloodhound that has misplaced its owner and decided to interrogate every chicken coop within a 1,000-mile radius, it seems irresistibly drawn to distant adventures. The South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Red Sea, and various other seas that most American voters could not confidently locate on a map have often received considerably more attention than the chilly stretch of water that gave the alliance its name. One might reasonably ask whether NATO headquarters contains a globe with the North Atlantic accidentally painted over. In 2026, President Trump reportedly developed a sudden interest in the Strait of Hormuz, having previously assumed it was either a psychological disorder or a new line of slimming trousers. Upon learning that it was in fact a narrow waterway through which large quantities of oil passed, he concluded that the strait was functioning much like a giant geopolitical straitjacket, cruelly restricting the free movement of petroleum molecules on their God-given journey around the planet. Trump the Big Lump therefore resolved to liberate these oppressed hydrocarbons. Strapping on his 6 shooters and mounting a horse that existed only in his imagination, he announced that anyone interfering with the sacred flow of oil would be sent back to the Stone Age, an era with which he was allegedly familiar from personal experience. At his side rode his trusted sidekicks, Bad Boy Hegseth, who believed every international dispute could be solved with a larger explosion, and a Sundance Vance, who approached foreign policy with the calm restraint of a raccoon trapped inside a church organ. The years 2025 and 2026 proved particularly entertaining for students of diplomatic chaos. The United States increasingly resembled a wealthy uncle who had attended one too many family reunions and now spent his weekends threatening to sue his relatives. Small allies found themselves receiving unexpected lectures, unsolicited advice, and occasional demands that sounded suspiciously like medieval tribute. Denmark was scolded. Canada was lectured. Greenland was treated rather like a garden shed that somebody had suddenly decided to purchase despite the inconvenient fact that it already belonged to someone else. Meanwhile, the rest of the world received varying quantities of what Washington called leadership and what others occasionally described using less flattering vocabulary. Britain, long celebrated by critics as America's faithful poodle, remained loyally trotting alongside the imperial caravan. Yet there were moments when the relationship seemed less like that of master and pet and more like that of an aging sidekick who discovers, halfway through the film, that he has not actually been invited to the sequel. After enthusiastically assisting in various grand criminal adventures abroad, including those justified by dossiers, intelligence reports, and other works of imaginative literature, Britain sometimes appeared bewildered to discover itself standing alone in the rain while Washington had already wandered off in pursuit of a new crisis. By 2026, the old bulldog of empire occasionally resembled a lonely skunk roaming a farmyard, searching desperately for someone, anyone, willing to engage in a diplomatic squabble. Unfortunately, the chickens had become busy, the cows were indifferent, and even the geese had started returning its phone calls with suspicious delay. Such are the hazards of international friendship. One day you are saving civilization, the next day you are standing in a puddle, clutching a faded special relationship, wondering whether the Americans have changed the locks again. But I digress. I was talking about breakfasts, not geopolitics. The point is that there is arguably no such thing as an American breakfast. What most Filipino hotels mean is a breakfast that originated in Britain and emigrated across the Atlantic centuries ago before returning to Asia under a different name. Many ordinary colonized Filipinos, especially those from poorer backgrounds, know America through films, television, basketball, and history. Britain occupies a much smaller corner of the popular imagination. Scotland occupies a smaller one still. Explaining the distinction between England, Scotland, Great Britain, and the United Kingdom can sometimes resemble explaining medieval theology to a confused water buffalo. The question remains, why call it an American breakfast rather than a British breakfast? The answer is the same reason Filipinos play basketball rather than cricket. History intervened. The Philippines became an American colony rather than a British one. India, Pakistan, South Africa, and the West Indies inherited cricket, the Philippines inherited basketball. From an outsider's perspective, basketball seems a curious national passion. Filipinos are generally not a tall people, yet they pursue the sport with extraordinary enthusiasm. Watching a local game can feel like watching a flock of determined sparrows challenge the laws of geometry. The players may lack height, but they seldom lack courage. The Philippines remains a highly Americanized society in many respects. One positive consequence is the widespread use of English, which often makes travel easier than in other parts of Southeast Asia. But back to breakfast. The Filipinos, like the Norwegians, occasionally commit strange crimes against bacon. Proper bacon should be either succulent and meaty or crisp enough to snap pleasantly between one's teeth. Hotel bacon sometimes resembled the leather footwear Charlie Chaplin attempted to eat in The Gold Rush. One half expected to find shoelaces attached. Filipino breakfasts are often an acquired taste. Dried salted fish, known locally as daing, inspires devotion in some people and alarm in others. John usually ordered the American breakfast. He was fully aware that it was probably among the least healthy meals ever devised by mankind, but old habits die hard. Whenever he experienced one of his periodic attacks of health consciousness, he ordered the Japanese breakfast instead and regretted his virtue almost immediately. In truth, his healthiest breakfast was probably a mango, a banana, and a cup of coffee purchased from a nearby shop. Unless one intends to spend the day plowing fields or unloading cargo at the docks, there seems little need to consume enough food to sustain a cavalry regiment. The subject reminded him of holidays in Britain during the 1980s with his Norwegian girlfriend, Nina. They often stayed in hotels in the southwest of England that specialized in the famous English breakfast: eggs, black pudding, beans, tomatoes, mushrooms, fried bread, generous portions of bacon, toast, marmalade, grapefruit, and enough coffee to keep a small newspaper running for a week. Some establishments also offered smoked haddock and other fish dishes. John was in his 30s then and could still consume such breakfasts without hearing immediate protests from his internal organs. What one eats, he reflected, depends very much on one's age and occupation. A farm laborer may require a heroic breakfast. A middle-aged academic requires little more than coffee and optimism. But there I go again, wandering away from the story like a distracted Victorian novelist. John was supposed to be saying goodbye to Angelica. She had told him she needed to return home to look after her young child. Before leaving, she said she hoped they would meet again soon. If he decided to visit the Gold Coast bar one evening, she told him, he should call her first. "Text me, okay," she said with a smile. They kissed. John watched her walk down the corridor towards the lifts. It was a scene he would repeat many times during his travels in the Philippines. The women came from different provinces, spoke different dialects, and carried different stories. Some were students, some single mothers, some dreamers hoping to escape poverty, and some simply adventurers making their way through life as best they could. He was always a little sad to see one of his companions depart, yet equally grateful for the return of silence. Human company, he reflected, was rather like music. One enjoys the melody, but occasionally appreciates the pause between songs. The lift doors closed. Angelica disappeared from view. For a moment John stood quietly with his coffee cup in hand. Below him Manila was already awake. Jeepneys rattled through the streets, vendors called out their greetings, and somewhere a karaoke machine was undoubtedly preparing to assault the musical legacy of Frank Sinatra. Life in the Philippines was rarely dull. Like a good breakfast, it was sometimes strange, occasionally unhealthy, frequently excessive, but almost always memorable.